Hi everyone in UPP land, it's week 5 and this week we're looking at managing information and in particular recording bibliographic information. Before making any real commentary about this week's material or content, I'd like to say that for me this week is about you actually doing something rather than actually listening or reading. I'm hoping when you get into and get involved with the bibliographic sheets and the exercise that's related to them, you will come to, work out the value of recording information in certain ways, which makes ultimately your work a lot easier in terms of writing and producing assessment material. Looking at the PowerPoint this week, there's only a handful of slides really, 18 to be exact. Contained within them is really just some background, and I would say minor background, into some of the material related to recording information. The nub of the issue is, for me, relates to not only the acknowledgement of your sources, which I think is incredibly important because other people have had those ideas, they've done that particular work, so you should acknowledge those sources as such, but also about plagiarism. So it's about honesty and integrity around your work. If you've taken an idea or a quote from somewhere else, you should be happy to acknowledge it and refer to it in your work, just so that person gets the credit that they deserve. My own position around plagiarism is simply that I would prefer to get poor work that's actually written by you, with or without referencing, than getting work that's been copied from somewhere else. The reason this is the case is that generally if you hand in work that needs improvement, you can work out from your lecturer's comments or your tutor's comments ways that you can improve your work over time to get better grades. However, if you're actually plagiarising material, which means to copy from other people without acknowledging them as your source, you're literally, in a sense, shortchanging yourself, because obviously if the work is from somewhere else, excuse the phone, if the work appears to be a standard that is not yours, there's no way of improving it. If someone else has actually done that work to an academic level, there's very little room for improvement. Hence you don't learn how you can improve your work, you're just simply... Anyway, without waffling, the point is that to hand in your own work, at least you've got, or you can see, areas to improve, and no doubt you will over time if you're prepared to take criticism and use it, or utilise it as a way of improvement. Anyway, having laboured the point a little too long, we'll move on to the PowerPoint. On slide 3 you'll see that we're looking at academic reading and what we term as the literature. You may or may not hear that term, but if nothing else, looking at academic material to read, and particularly in the use of writing, and I'll emphasise that I don't think you can actually extricate one from the other. We have research and writing, usually the two go hand in hand at university. If you're actually researching something, generally you have to produce something written as a response to what you've actually done in terms of the research. Anyway, for us, the literature at university would simply be material that a lecturer would gather for a particular assessment, or, in a broader sense, would be all the material that's been written. So in other words, the literature relating to a particular subject or topic. Having found your way through, or navigated your way through all this material, so the literature, we come to the point where we have the prospect of good housekeeping. So it's actually to the point where we're looking at being efficient with the material that we're looking at. We know for a fact if we're actually going to be producing anything that could be nominally called academic, we have to include all the references we've used to compile that particular piece of work. However, at a more practical level, if we record the information, in other words the material we've researched, we can, it helps organise our work in the sense that we can actually trace and track ideas that we've come across and that we're writing about. It also allows easier retrieval of that material. So actually when we need to find material again, say for instance we've found a particular author who's written extensively about a subject, we then can trace that author back again and find the material fairly easily in the library or through the UTAS library system. The other thing, of course, is, and I've said this before, and I have to reiterate it, it avoids unintentional plagiarism, which to me, again, is fairly important. Most people submit work, possibly with flaws with their referencing. The first time that's a mistake, and that's forgivable. Beyond the first time, generally you should be learning about how you reference material so you avoid the prospect of plagiarism. Jumping ahead in the PowerPoint, there's several terms that you actually need to know as you go along, and those terms include bibliography, a reference list, and citation, and even things like referencing style. And I just want to briefly explain all of those things, even though I think the definitions are fairly succinct and to the point in the PowerPoint. But anyway, for the point of reinforcement, let's go ahead. For bibliography, all that simply means is that if there's any work that you've actually used and you've cited, it should appear in your reference list. A reference list literally is a statement about all of the ideas, all the things that you've used directly in the work that you can reference in that sense. In contrast, a bibliography is all the things that you've looked at. So rather than just the citations, a bibliography is all the material you've looked at. So that might include maybe an encyclopedia, maybe a dictionary, maybe a whole range of other material which didn't actually get cited in your work per se. So there was no quotes, there was no material taken from there directly and used in your work. However, you may have read a book which gave you ideas about a particular topic. However, those ideas weren't actually expressed or developed in any real sense. Or perhaps they were a platform to find other material to use. In here you might also include things like newspapers and so on, magazine articles, even TV productions. Now, just briefly, I need to explain the term citation, and as it says in the PowerPoint, it refers to a form used within the body of a piece of writing to acknowledge an academic source. And often with citations, it doesn't necessarily have to include a quote or so on, although it often does. But you may be using material in that sense directly from an author, an idea, a statement, a quote, whatever, in your work that you need to actually acknowledge. So that is a citation. Usually what happens is an in-text citation is a lot shorter. It depends on the actual system you're using, so how you actually record your references. But normally there's a short citation in the in-text as an in-text reference, and the longer reference appears in the bibliography or reference list. Now the broader I guess idea about referencing falls into a range of different categories. However, there are styles, and those styles vary from faculty to faculty. For us, we're using the Harvard style. There's a couple of kind of sub-genres in the Harvard style, but generally, like I said, the Harvard style is used throughout the arts. However, for instance, with psychology it's the APA system. The key point to note here is the fact that each faculty uses a different one, and in that you have to follow those guidelines, even if it varies to the point where you're using 2 or 3 different systems across a single year. You still have to apply that system and use it both efficiently and correctly. Often marks are taken off if you actually do not do these things accurately. I want you all to explore these different aspects of recording information so you understand them well. If you have any questions, by all means email the distance tutor or ask me directly, because these are essential terms and you need to be able to understand and record information correctly to make any headway with academic work. The doing bit of this week, which is what I stated at the start of this recording, is actually completing a bibliographical details record sheet. For me, even though these may seem a little bit arduous to do, they are worth just doing for the practice. With time, this will just become routine, so every time you sit down to do an assessment and so on, you'll actually be thinking beforehand about your references and how you record those. And advice, perhaps the best advice I can give you about doing reference lists or bibliographical lists is simply that do them as you go along. So actually write them, complete them as you go along. So say for instance you have a Word document, so you're writing a 500 word essay. You might have 3 or 4 references that you want to use, or citations that you want to use. As you go along, so you start writing, so you put your in-text reference within the body of the work, you immediately put the full reference at the end. And all that does is simply travel down the page as you write, and it means literally as you end the writing, you've got a full bibliographical list there, or reference list there, which saves time and effort. And even though sometimes it's an interruption while you're actually writing, for me, it's so efficient, and it ensures that you don't have to rely on memory, but also backtracking or backtracing material that should simply be present already. Doing anything retrospectively in this sense, it becomes a chore, and that's something you don't want to be doing when you're actually writing a whole bunch of assessments or assignments. A very brief explanation about what you have to do with the bibliographical record sheets is simply look through and read the clues that are given on the worksheet. So there's actually a series of record sheets which I recommend you either print off, or maybe you can do them on screen. I'll leave that up to you. And then read through the worksheet, which gives you an outline, first of all, of what you should be doing and why you're doing it. The second thing is the actual clues, which helps you under each section, so books, journals and websites, helps you to trace down these particular items. In terms of you finding them, obviously record them all on the different recording sheets, and the answers will be lodged on Milo in week 6. Anyway, I've said too much for this week, considering it's actually a doing week rather than a listening week. I'd say good luck. I hope all goes well. Again, if you have any issues with this, by all means contact us. And sorry again about some of the interruptions. Inevitably these recordings are compromised by phone calls and people coming to the door, and despite a sign on the door saying please don't irritate me, but please don't knock, just wait, people still inevitably come in. Anyway, look, good luck, have a great week, see ya.